The day I buried my husband, my own family chose a birthday party instead of his funeral. While I stood beside his grave saying goodbye to the man who had loved me for 15 years, my phone filled with smiling photos of my mother raising a glass, my sister blowing out birthday candles, and a caption that read, "Family is everything." I said nothing. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I simply watched them disappear from my life. For 6 long months, not one of them called to ask if I was alive. Then one ordinary Saturday morning, a single newspaper headline changed everything. Suddenly, the same people who couldn't drive 11 minutes to my husband's funeral were calling me over and over again, desperate to see me, desperate to apologize, and desperate to claim something they believed now belonged to them. They thought they were coming back to reclaim their daughter. They had no idea they were walking straight into the biggest mistake of their lives. The morning I buried my husband, I believed grief had already shown me its cruelest face. I was wrong. As the minister lowered Daniel's casket into the ground, my phone vibrated inside my coat. I ignored it at first, thinking it was another condolence message. But something made me look. What filled my screen wasn't sympathy, it was 28 cheerful photos from my younger sister's birthday party. Gold balloons. Crystal glasses raised in celebration. My mother smiling directly into the camera as if nothing tragic had happened that day. Only 20 minutes earlier, she had texted me 4 cold words, "We can't make it." They hadn't missed the funeral because they were sick, stranded, or grieving. They skipped my husband's final goodbye because canceling a birthday reservation felt like too much trouble. Standing beside the man I had loved for 15 years, surrounded by strangers who came to honor him, I realized every seat reserved for my own family was empty. I promised myself I wouldn't argue, wouldn't beg for answers, and wouldn't post a single angry word online. I simply slipped my phone back into my pocket and watched the cemetery workers finish covering the grave. At that moment, I thought losing my husband was the greatest heartbreak of my life. I had no idea that 6 months later, one newspaper headline would send the very people who abandoned me calling my phone again and again, desperate to be part of a life they had already chosen to walk away from. The next few days passed like I was living inside someone else's life. Every morning I woke expecting to hear Daniel humming in the kitchen while making coffee, only to remember the silence waiting outside my bedroom door. His side of the bed stayed untouched because I couldn't bring myself to erase the last place that still felt like him. While I struggled to breathe through each hour, the rest of our town seemed determined to prove what kind of man he had truly been. Daniel had owned a small neighborhood hardware store for nearly 2 decades. Most people thought he simply sold tools, paint, and garden supplies. They never realized he spent just as much time quietly helping people as he did making sales. If an elderly couple couldn't afford repairs, he'd find a way to lower the price. If a teenager wanted to learn carpentry, he'd stay after closing to teach them. If someone walked into his store carrying worry instead of money, Daniel always found something more valuable than profit to give them: hope. By the morning after his death, flowers covered the entrance to the store. Customers left handwritten letters between the bouquets. Children taped crayon drawings to the windows. Local contractors closed their businesses for an hour just to stand outside together in silence. His best friend and store manager, Walter, unlocked the front door with trembling hands because neither opening nor keeping it closed felt right anymore. The funeral arrived only 5 days later. More than 200 people filled the church. Every pew was occupied, and dozens stood quietly along the walls because there were no seats left. Teachers I had worked with came. Firefighters, plumbers, mechanics, business owners, and families Daniel had helped over the years all stood together to say goodbye. But one thing was impossible to ignore. The front row, reserved for my family, remained completely empty. The empty seats hurt more than any speech ever could. Then something happened that I will never forget. An elderly woman named Martha, my neighbor of only a few years, slowly stood from the middle of the church. Without saying a single word, she walked down the aisle and sat beside me in the empty family row. She reached over, held my hand, and never let go until the service ended. A woman who had known me for 6 years chose to stand beside me. The people who had known me my entire life never even walked through the church doors. At that moment, I finally understood a painful truth. Sometimes the people who share your last name are not the people who stand beside you when your world falls apart. And I still had no idea that the cruelest part of that day was waiting for me at the cemetery. Losing Daniel forced me to remember things I had spent years trying to ignore. When you're married to someone who truly loves you, you stop noticing how little love you've accepted everywhere else. I met Daniel 12 years earlier when the heating system in my classroom failed during the middle of winter. The school district kept delaying repairs, so the students sat through science lessons wearing coats and gloves. Someone recommended a local hardware store owner who never says no if someone genuinely needs help. That was Daniel. He arrived after closing time carrying nothing but a toolbox and a warm smile. He repaired the heater in less than an hour, refused to charge a single dollar, and left before I could even thank him properly. The next afternoon I walked into his store with homemade cookies just to repay his kindness. We talked for nearly 2 hours. A year later, we were married. Not in a grand ballroom. Not in front of hundreds of guests. Just a quiet courthouse ceremony with a few close friends and enough happiness to last a lifetime. Daniel never cared about expensive cars, designer clothes, or impressing strangers. He drove the same old pickup truck for years because, as he liked to joke, if it still gets me home, it still deserves another chance. That simple way of living was exactly what my family never understood. To my parents, success was something you displayed. It wasn't about kindness. It wasn't about character. It wasn't even about happiness. It was about appearances. My younger sister married a wealthy dentist with a luxury home, expensive vacations, and picture-perfect holiday photos. Every family gathering somehow became another celebration of their life together. Meanwhile, Daniel was always introduced with the same quiet sentence. He owns the little hardware store. Never, he's the kindest man in town. Never, he helps everyone. Just the hardware store owner. One Christmas, I accidentally overheard my mother talking with one of my aunts in the kitchen. My aunt mentioned how Daniel had spent an entire snowstorm clearing elderly neighbors' driveways for free. My mother's response came without hesitation. Well, he's a nice man, but he's still just a shopkeeper. She didn't sound angry. She didn't sound cruel. She sounded certain. As though a person's value could be measured by their job title instead of the lives they touched. I never told Daniel what she had said. Not because I wanted to protect him. Because I already knew his answer. He would have smiled, shrugged his shoulders, and gone back to helping the next customer. That's who he was. While my family spent years chasing status, Daniel quietly built something far more valuable. A reputation that no amount of money could ever buy. And after he was gone, I was about to discover he had also built something else. Something my own family never imagined existed. Something that would change every one of our lives forever. The weeks after Daniel's funeral didn't pass. They dragged. Every morning felt exactly like the one before it, heavy, quiet, and somehow even lonelier than the last. I returned to teaching because 13-year-olds ask too many questions to let you disappear inside your own grief. For a few hours each day, I could pretend life still had structure. But every afternoon, I drove home to a house that sounded wrong without Daniel's footsteps echoing through it. His favorite coffee mug stayed on the kitchen shelf. His work boots remained beside the back door. Even his old truck stayed parked in the driveway because I couldn't bring myself to move it. Some evenings, I sat inside that truck for nearly an hour. The seat still carried the scent of cedar wood, machine oil, and the peppermint gum he chewed every afternoon. Closing the driver's door was the closest thing I had to hearing his voice again. During all those months, my phone stayed painfully quiet. Not once did my mother call to ask if I had eaten. Not once did my father stop by to see how I was managing. My sister never asked if I needed company. 6 months. Not a single visit. Not a single family dinner. Not even a birthday card. The only message my mother sent arrived nearly a month after the funeral. I hope you're doing okay. By the way, was Daniel carrying any debts? People have been asking. I stared at the screen for several minutes.
My husband had barely been gone a few weeks, and somehow the first thing that truly interested her wasn't my grief. It was our finances. I replied with only 3 words. Everything is fine. Then I deleted the conversation. By early winter, I received a letter from the attorney handling Daniel's estate. I expected paperwork. Maybe insurance forms. Maybe ownership documents for the hardware store. Instead, I walked into that office and discovered a part of my husband even I hadn't fully understood. For over 20 years, Daniel had quietly invested almost every extra dollar he earned. No flashy investments. No risky schemes. Just patient, consistent saving. The hardware store building belonged to him outright. Several rental properties were fully paid off. His investment accounts had grown steadily year after year. When the attorney finished adding everything together, she gently slid one final page across the desk. The total value of Daniel's estate was just over $2 million. I couldn't speak. Not because of the money. Because I suddenly realized what those numbers represented. Every early morning, every late night, every sacrifice, every vacation we postponed, every old truck he kept driving instead of buying a new one. This wasn't wealth. It was 20 years of discipline, kindness, and quiet purpose written on paper. Then the attorney handed me one last envelope. It wasn't part of the legal documents. It was handwritten. Inside was a single folded page in Daniel's familiar handwriting. If you're reading this, don't let the dream die. Attached to the note was an old notebook filled with sketches, plans, and ideas we had talked about for years, but never had the chance to build. As tears rolled down my face, I finally understood something. Daniel hadn't spent 20 years building wealth for himself. He had spent 20 years preparing to change someone else's future. And I knew exactly what I had to do next.
For several days after leaving the attorney's office, I couldn't bring myself to make any major decisions. The papers stayed untouched on my dining room table. So did Daniel's notebook. Every evening, I opened it, turned another page, and found another dream he had never stopped believing in. There were rough sketches of workbenches, lists of tools, ideas for weekend classes, notes about teaching young people skills that schools no longer offered. Across the top of one page, written in his familiar handwriting, were 5 simple words. Everyone deserves someone to believe. I read that sentence so many times that I eventually stopped crying every time I saw it. Instead, I started planning. The hardware store had been closed since Daniel's funeral. People kept stopping outside to look through the windows. Some left flowers. Others simply stood there for a minute before walking away. One cold Saturday morning, someone knocked on the front door. When I unlocked it, I found a nervous young man standing on the sidewalk. His name was Ethan. He was 19 years old and had worked part-time at the store during weekends. His hands stayed buried inside his jacket pockets as he spoke. "I know things have changed," he said quietly. "But Daniel promised he'd teach me the trade after graduation." He quickly looked down. "I understand if that can't happen anymore." It was obvious he had rehearsed those words 100 times. I invited him inside. The store still smelled exactly the same. fresh-cut lumber, paint, machine oil. For a moment, it felt as if Daniel might walk out of the back room carrying another box of supplies. Instead, there was only silence. Ethan walked slowly through the aisles, touching the shelves the way people touch photographs. "He believed in me," he whispered. "No one's ever done that before." Those 7 words changed everything. This wasn't just Daniel's dream anymore. It had become a responsibility. That afternoon, I called Walter. "I think it's time," I told him. The following Saturday, Myers Hardware opened its doors again. Not because business mattered. Because Daniel's legacy did. The entire town seemed to know we were reopening. Customers filled the store from morning until closing. Many bought things they clearly didn't need. A single paintbrush. 1 box of screws. A pair of work gloves. No one came to shop. They came to keep Daniel's store alive. Some shared stories I'd never heard. Others simply shook my hand and thanked me for reopening. By the end of the first week, something inside me had changed. For months, grief had convinced me I was completely alone. But every customer who walked through those doors proved the opposite. Daniel hadn't left me with an empty life. He had left me surrounded by people whose lives he had quietly changed. And soon, the entire town would learn about the dream hidden inside that old notebook. Spring arrived quietly. The snow melted. The hardware store was busy again. Every afternoon after finishing school, I drove straight there, helped Walter close up, and then spent my evenings working on Daniel's biggest dream. The old storage building behind the shop slowly transformed into a workshop. New benches replaced broken shelves. The walls were painted. Secondhand tools were repaired instead of replaced because Daniel had always believed a well-used tool still had years of purpose left. Only a handful of people knew what we were building. I wasn't trying to keep it secret. I just wasn't ready to explain it yet. Then one afternoon, a local newspaper reporter walked into the store. She introduced herself with a warm smile and admitted she'd been one of Daniel's customers for years. "I've been hearing rumors," she said. "They tell me something special is happening here." I looked around the empty store. For a long moment, I considered saying no. But then my eyes landed on Daniel's notebook resting behind the counter. Maybe it was finally time. A week later, the reporter returned with a photographer. Instead of asking about money, she asked about Daniel. She wanted to know why people loved him. Why customers still left flowers months after his funeral. Why a simple hardware store meant so much to an entire town. For nearly 2 hours, I told her stories. About the free repairs. The teenagers he mentored. The families he quietly helped. The dreams hidden inside that old notebook. I never once mentioned my parents. Or my sister. Or the empty seats at the funeral. This story wasn't about them. It never deserved to be. The article appeared in Saturday morning's newspaper. Across the front page was a large photograph of me standing beside the unfinished workshop. The headline read, "Widow fulfills husband's dream community trade school to open this summer." By breakfast, the entire town had read it. By lunchtime, 3 neighboring towns had shared it online. And by dinner, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. The first call came from my mother. I let it ring. 5 minutes later, she called again. Then my father. Then my sister. Then relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. People who had somehow forgotten my number after Daniel died had suddenly remembered exactly how to reach me. By the end of the afternoon, I counted 12 missed calls. Not one of those people had called during the 6 months I cried myself to sleep. Not one had offered help when I needed it most. But one newspaper article. One public success. And suddenly, they all wanted to reconnect. I placed my phone face down on the kitchen table and made myself a cup of tea. For the first time in months. I wasn't crying. I was paying attention. Because after years of making excuses for my family, I finally saw the pattern clearly. They hadn't come back because they missed me. They had come back because they believed I had become someone worth standing next to. And I had a feeling. Their real reason for calling hadn't even been revealed yet. 3 days after the article appeared, my mother finally stopped calling. Instead, she showed up at my front door. She arrived carrying a bouquet of flowers and the same warm smile she used whenever other people were watching. The moment I opened the door, she wrapped me in a hug so tight it almost felt real. "I've missed you so much," she whispered. Funny, she hadn't missed me once in the 6 months after Daniel died. I invited her inside. She slowly looked around my living room as though she had never seen it before. Her eyes lingered on the handmade bookshelves Daniel had built, the oak dining table he had restored, the photographs hanging above the fireplace. For years, none of it had interested her. Now she noticed everything. We sat down with coffee, and after a few minutes of awkward conversation, she finally reached the reason she had come. "We've all been talking," she said carefully. "The family is so proud of what you're doing." I nodded without answering. She took my silence as permission to continue. "Your father thinks the trade school will become something really important." "I'm sure it will," I replied. A smile spread across her face. "That's exactly why we should all be involved." There it was. Not grief. Not regret. An opportunity. She leaned forward. "You know, this project represents the whole family." I looked directly at her. "No," I said calmly. "It represents Daniel." For a split second, her smile disappeared. Then it returned, polished and practiced. She changed the subject. "That Sunday, she invited me to dinner. The whole family will be there," she said. "It'll be just like old times." Against my better judgment, I accepted. Not because I believed anything had changed, because I wanted to know what they really wanted. The moment I walked into my parents' house, everything felt rehearsed. The expensive dishes had been taken out. My favorite meal sat on the table. Even my father greeted me with unusual enthusiasm. It wasn't a family dinner. It was a performance. Everyone kept asking questions about the school. How many students would attend? Who would manage it? How much land did it include? Would local businesses sponsor it? Every question sounded innocent. But together, they formed a picture. They weren't interested in Daniel's dream. They were measuring its value. Dessert hadn't even been served when my brother-in-law finally spoke. "I've actually been thinking," he said. "My dental practice has a chance to expand." He smiled confidently. "It just needs a little investment." I already knew where the conversation was going. He named the amount. $150,000. Then my mother quietly placed her hand over mine. "Family helps family," she said softly. I looked around the table. 6 months earlier, not one person in that room had offered to help me bury my husband. Now they were asking me to finance their future. I didn't argue. I asked only one question. "When Daniel died," I looked at each face one by one. "Why didn't any of you come to help me?" The room became completely silent. No one answered. Because there wasn't an answer. Only excuses. And before the night was over, they would ask for something far more valuable than money. They wanted Daniel's name itself. I left my parents' house that night with more answers than I had expected. None of them made me feel better. 2 days later, my younger sister called. Not a text. Not a voicemail. An actual phone call. Her voice sounded different. Quieter. "Can I come see you?" she asked. Just me. When she arrived, she looked nothing like the confident woman from the birthday photos. She looked exhausted. We sat at my kitchen table for nearly 10 minutes before either of us spoke. Finally, she whispered something I never expected to hear. "I asked Mom to cancel my birthday dinner." I looked up. I begged her. She nodded slowly. "When Aunt Linda told us Daniel's funeral was on the same day, I told Mom we could celebrate another weekend." "What did she say?" My sister laughed once. It wasn't a happy laugh. She said the restaurant deposit wasn't refundable. I stared at her. "That was it." She nodded. $200. For a moment, neither of us spoke. My husband's funeral had been worth less than a dinner reservation. Then I asked the question that had haunted me since the cemetery. "The birthday pictures." She immediately looked away. "I didn't post them." "So who did?" "Mom." She swallowed hard. She took my phone while everyone was eating. I felt my stomach tighten. She said birthdays should be celebrated, and grief didn't need an audience. The room became painfully quiet. For the first time, I realized my sister had been living inside the same family story I had. She hadn't created it. She had simply never found the courage to escape it. I believed she regretted everything. I also knew regret couldn't change what had already happened. The empty chairs at the funeral would always remain empty. A few days later, my father visited the hardware store alone. He wandered through the aisles pretending to shop before finally placing a hammer on the counter. He already owned several. He wasn't there to buy tools. He was there because he didn't know how to say he was sorry. After a long silence, he quietly said, "Your mother only wants this family together again." I rang up the hammer without looking away. Then I asked him one simple question. "Where were you when they buried Daniel?" He froze. His eyes dropped to the counter. He stopped. There was cake. The words barely escaped his mouth. For the first time in my life, I watched my father hear his own excuse out loud, and I could see that he hated it. He paid for the hammer, left without taking his change, and never looked back. That afternoon, I drove to visit my aunt, the only person in the family who had never lied to me. She listened quietly before telling me something I had never known. "When your mother was 12, she began, your grandfather lost everything. The family business collapsed. Furniture was carried onto the front lawn. Neighbors stood outside watching. Children whispered at school. Your mother spent years believing that being poor was the worst shame a person could carry. Everything she does now," my aunt sighed, "is about making sure no one ever looks down on her again." For the first time, I understood my mother's fear, but understanding her didn't erase what she had done. Pain might explain someone's choices. It never excuses them. And with the ribbon-cutting ceremony only days away, I knew my family wasn't finished trying to rewrite Daniel's legacy. The hardest confrontation of my life was still waiting for me. The morning of the ribbon-cutting ceremony arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze. By 8 o'clock, volunteers were already arranging rows of folding chairs outside the old hardware store. Students carried toolboxes into the workshop. Local business owners delivered coffee and pastries. Neighbors hung banners across the entrance. Everywhere I looked, I saw people who had shown up simply because Daniel had once shown up for them. No one had been paid to be there. They came because they wanted to. As I stood near the stage, watching everything come together, Walter walked over carrying a wooden plaque wrapped in a cloth. "You ready?" he asked. I smiled. "As ready as I'll ever be." He gently lifted the cloth. Carved into the oak, in Daniel's own handwriting copied from his notebook, were the words he had lived by. "Leave every person better than you found them." For a moment, I couldn't speak. It felt like he was standing beside me. Then I heard expensive car doors closing behind me. My family had arrived. My mother stepped out first, wearing the same elegant blue dress she always chose for photographs. My father followed quietly. My sister and her husband walked several steps behind. The cameras hadn't even started rolling, yet my mother was already smiling at everyone she passed. She moved through the crowd as though she were hosting the event herself. Then she noticed the front row. Every chair had a name card. Walter, Ethan, Mrs. Harris, the widow Daniel had helped rebuild her porch, the high school principal, the mayor, and one chair left empty. A single white card rested on it, reserved for Daniel Carter. There wasn't a single reserved seat for my family. My mother's smile disappeared. She walked directly toward me. Her voice stayed soft enough that no one else could hear. "I think there's been a mistake." I looked at the seating chart. "I don't think so. We're family." So was Daniel. She pressed her lips together. "You should move us to the front." I shook my head. The people in those seats earned them. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she tried another approach. "When you give your speech," she whispered, "make sure you thank the family." I looked into her eyes. "What family?" She blinked. "The one that abandoned me?" Her face hardened. "You don't have to embarrass us." I answered quietly. "I'm not planning to mention you at all." The ceremony began a few minutes later. The crowd applauded as I stepped to the microphone. I looked across nearly 200 faces. Teachers, mechanics, students, retired neighbors, customers, friends, people who had become my family without sharing my last name. I began speaking about Daniel, not the businessman, not the investor, the man, the husband who believed every person deserved a second chance, the man who fixed broken things without asking who owned them, the man who quietly changed lives while asking for nothing in return. Then I invited Ethan onto the stage. Our very first apprentice, I said proudly. The crowd applauded. Walter joined us next. Then the volunteers. Then the students. Every single person standing beside me had helped turn Daniel's dream into reality. My family remained seated in the fourth row, watching, waiting, expecting. Finally, I reached the end of my speech. There is one final thing I want everyone to know. The crowd became silent. This school, I paused, will never be renamed. The trust protecting it is permanent. It belongs to Daniel's legacy. It always will. For the first time that morning, I looked toward the fourth row. I didn't say my mother's name. I didn't need to. The message had already reached exactly who it was meant for. The applause that followed echoed through the entire street. My mother slowly stood. Without saying a word, she turned and walked away. Her heels clicked against the pavement until even that sound disappeared. For the first time in my life, she left because she had no story left to control. And as I watched her car drive away, I realized something unexpected. I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. But the greatest surprise of the entire day wasn't my mother's departure. It happened after everyone else had gone home. When the last guest finally left, the parking lot grew quiet. The folding chairs were stacked. The banners had been taken down. Only a few volunteers remained inside the workshop, sweeping away the sawdust from a day none of us would ever forget. I stood alone beneath the wooden sign hanging over the entrance. I ran my fingers across Daniel's carved words. For months, I had imagined this day ending with anger. Instead, it ended with peace. A few weeks later, the first class officially began. 12 students walked through those doors carrying more hope than experience. Some had never held a hammer. Some had dropped out of college. Others simply needed someone to believe they were capable of building a future. Walter taught the morning classes. Local electricians and carpenters volunteered in the afternoons. I continued teaching science during the day and spent every evening at the workshop. For the first time since Daniel died, I stopped counting what I had lost. I started counting the lives being changed. Months passed. One afternoon, Ethan walked into my office wearing a brand new work uniform. His face carried the same nervous smile I'd seen the day he knocked on the locked hardware store door. "I got the job," he said. "A full apprenticeship." He paused before adding, "Daniel believed I could do this long before I believed it myself." I smiled through tears. His dream wasn't ending. It was multiplying. Not everyone in my family stayed the same. My sister visited more often, never asking for money, never asking for favors. Sometimes she simply helped clean the workshop after classes ended. We never pretended the past hadn't happened. We just stopped pretending the future had to look the same. My father began visiting the store once every month. He always bought something small. A screwdriver, a box of nails, sandpaper he probably didn't need. One evening, as he was leaving, he quietly stopped beside me. Without looking into my eyes, he said, "Daniel would have been proud of you." It wasn't enough to erase the years, but it was honest. And sometimes honesty arrives long after the apology should have. My mother never apologized. She continued telling people she had always supported the school. She smiled for photographs. She protected the version of herself she wanted the town to believe. For the first time in my life, I didn't try to correct her. Because I had finally learned something that grief had spent months teaching me. Not every lie deserves your energy. Not every argument deserves your voice. Sometimes your life becomes the only answer people need. Every evening before locking the workshop, I still pause beneath Daniel's sign. Students laugh inside. Tools echo against the workbenches. The building is alive. And I often think back to that terrible message I received while standing beside his grave. We can't make it. At the time, I believed those 4 words had destroyed my family. Now I understand something different. They didn't destroy my family. They revealed who was never truly part of it. Family isn't decided by blood. It isn't decided by photographs. It isn't decided by appearances. Family is the people who stand beside you when there is nothing to gain. The people who arrive without being asked. The people who stay after everyone else has gone home. Daniel spent his life building that kind of family. I was simply blessed enough to finish what he started. And every student who walks through those workshop doors proves the same truth. A person's greatest legacy isn't the money they leave behind. It's the lives they leave better than they found them.